He was the man who shook the Roman Empire from its core. But few ever knew how a boy from the provinces rose to control the most powerful state in the world. This is the untold journey of Emperor Hadrian, and you won't believe how it ends. Hadrian was born as Publius Aelius Hadrianus on the 24th of January, 76 AD in the city of Italica in southern Hispania, the Roman term for the Iberian Peninsula. His father was Publius Aelius Hadrianus Afer, a wealthy Roman senator who had served with distinction with the Roman army in North Africa, earning the agnomen Afer, meaning Africa, as a result of his service there. Afer's mother Ulpia was the sister of Marcus Ulpius Traianus, the father of the future Roman Emperor Trajan, who would rule between 98 AD and 117 AD. That made the young Hadrian Trajan's second cousin once removed, a family connection that would prove pivotal in determining the course of his life. Hadrian's mother was Domitia Paulina, a Roman woman whose family also had roots in Hispania, hailing from the city of Gades, modern-day Cadiz, one of the Roman colonies in the region. She and Hadrian's father also had a daughter named Aelia Domitia Paulina. We only have a handful of major sources with which to reconstruct the life of Emperor Hadrian. The foremost of these is the monumental Roman history of the 3rd century Greco-Roman historian and politician, Cassius Dio. Unfortunately, the original chapters of Cassius' work dealing with Hadrian's reign have been lost, though we do have a Byzantine-era epitome of these. Given this, historians are often forced to fall back on the Historia Augusta, a history of the Roman emperors of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, though one which is notoriously unreliable in its historical narrative, often presenting fantastical stories about the rulers of the empire that were clearly fabricated in order to entertain rather than inform. Fragments of other works are available, though they are not full biographical treatments of Hadrian. There are useful references to Hadrian's time in the Greek eastern provinces and his patronage of art and architecture there in the writings of Pausanias, a near contemporary of Hadrian's who, between the 150s and 170s AD, compiled a huge gazetteer of his travels through the Greek world and the buildings and temples he observed there. Beyond the written record, Hadrian left behind a large amount of buildings and artworks that he patronized the construction of and which attest to the elements of his reign. By the time Hadrian was born in 76 AD, the Roman Empire was the largest and most powerful state that the world had known up to that point. Its borders stretched from northern England in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south and from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to near the Caspian Sea and the Arabian Desert in the east. The period of greatest expansion had come in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC under the Roman Republic. Thereafter, Rome's first emperor, Caesar Augustus, who ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD, had urged his successors not to expand the empire any further, but rather to engage in a process of consolidation, setting the Rhine and Danube rivers as the northern frontier. His immediate successors, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, were of varying ability, some being tyrants like Caligula, others being relatively capable rulers like Claudius. For the most part, they had heeded his advice. Yet Roman rule remained tenuous in many locations. Typically, the imperial government was happy to rule with a light hand and to leave the provincials to administer their own affairs so long as they paid their taxes and didn't engage in any efforts to break away from Roman rule. Hadrian would be one of the few emperors who attempted a more interventionist type of rule in the provinces. At the time of Hadrian's birth, the emperor of Rome was Vespasian, who had himself seized power with the backing of the eastern legions of the Roman army in 69 AD, at the end of a civil war which had seen 4 other emperors, Nero, Otho, Galba, and Vitellius, come and go in the space of just over a year. After Vespasian's death in 79 AD, power was handed down to Vespasian's children, first Titus from 79 AD to 81 AD, and then later Domitian, who would himself rule the empire for 15 years between 81 AD and 96 AD. This era between 69 AD and 96 AD is referred to as the rule of the Flavian dynasty. Hadrian was still living in Spain at this time. His world and destiny were soon changed forever when both his mother and father died in quick succession in the mid-80s AD. As a result, Hadrian and his sister were placed under the protection of Publius Attianus and their second cousin Trajan, the latter of whom, by this time, was an important army officer with his own legionary command. After his parents' death, Hadrian initially stayed in Spain for 4 years, but was later summoned by his cousin to Rome around 91 AD, at around the same time that Trajan was given the powerful position of consul, the senior-most magistracy of the Roman state. Over the coming years, Hadrian continued his education in Rome. He became particularly fond of Greek culture, earning himself the nickname Greekling in due course. This was a quasi-disparaging moniker, something which indicates the love-hate relationship that the Romans had with all things Greek. After they began conquering the eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd century BC, the Romans adopted a vast array of Greek cultural habits and traits, yet they always were uneasy about this, and many people argued that Romans should continue to adhere to Roman virtues, which were perceived as more militaristic and conservative than those of the Greeks. Hadrian's association with Greek culture would garner much criticism in later years. Other than this, he was an avid pupil and was clearly possessed of a keen intellect. After concluding his academic education, he returned for a time to Spain, where he was further educated in more practical pursuits, such as outdoor sports and hunting, which were in essence a kind of basic training for military service. Wild boar hunting became one of Hadrian's favorite pastimes. By then, his personality was also becoming apparent to those around him. Hadrian was a paradoxical mix of an austere man, though genial and dignified, quick to act, though sometimes manipulative and deceitful. In short, he possessed many of the ambiguities which were necessary to make a good emperor. When he was aged 18, Hadrian returned to Rome and began his ascent within the city's politics, serving as a tribune and playing a role in the military, work which took him to the river Danube frontier in the Balkans for a time as a minor officer there during the frequent border clashes between the Romans and groups such as the Dacians, Marcomanni, and Sarmatians. After proving his ability, he was promoted and posted to the 5th Legion, where, according to accounts of the time, he served with distinction. As he was earning his stripes as a military officer on the northern frontier, matters were changing in Rome in ways which would have major implications for Hadrian. For years, Emperor Domitian, the third of the Flavian emperors, had been becoming more and more unpopular amongst the senatorial classes of the city, and in 96 AD, he was assassinated by court officials in his own apartments. The details of the plot that led to his death are shadowy, but it was clearly a well-planned and orchestrated affair, with the Roman Senate convening just hours after Domitian was killed to elect Marcus Cocceius Nerva, an elderly though well-respected senator, as Rome's new emperor. It was the first time in the history of the empire that an emperor had been elected rather than succeeding by familial succession or force of arms. As well as being quite elderly and childless, Nerva soon proved to be unpopular with the Roman army, being a figure who, somewhat surprisingly, had gone through a decades-long career as a senior Roman politician without ever having a major military command. Because of this, he soon appointed Hadrian's cousin Trajan as his designated successor and adopted him, in large part, it seems, because this would appease the Roman legions who respected Trajan as a senior commander on the Rhine frontier in the mid-90s AD. Trajan was popular with the ordinary Roman soldiers, and given Nerva's age, it was assumed that he would succeed Nerva before long. Then, since Trajan did not have any children himself, it was assumed that he too would have to adopt a successor, and there was every possibility, due to their familial ties, that Hadrian would be the person so chosen. Hence, the events of 96 AD and 97 AD, with Domitian's assassination, Nerva's election as emperor, and then Trajan's designation as his heir, all in quick succession, suddenly catapulted young Hadrian to a position of some importance within the politics of the Roman Empire. This was even more the case when, in January of 98 AD, only 1 year and 4 months after attaining power, Nerva died and Trajan was proclaimed as Emperor of Rome. Despite being related to Trajan, Hadrian's rise to power was also aided by his close ties with Trajan's wife, Pompeia Plotina. She was a woman who came from a prominent Roman family as well, one which was wealthy and politically powerful. Like both Trajan and Hadrian, she was born in Hispania. Plotina, along with her husband Anatianus, were the key figures in Hadrian's rise to power and influence within Rome, as they had raised and protected young Hadrian, as well as his sister, after their father's death. Indeed, many historians credit Plotina as having been responsible for Hadrian's education in Greek culture, which she herself held to be superior to Rome's. As her marriage with Trajan was childless, Plotina seems to have looked upon young Hadrian as a surrogate son, and around 100 AD, she arranged the marriage of Hadrian to her grandniece, Vibia Sabina, when he was 24 and Vibia Sabina was 14. It would be a somewhat distant marriage. While many Greeks and Romans were bisexual, Hadrian was almost certainly homosexual and did not enjoy the company of women. Hence, while his marriage served a political function, it was not a close one. In 101 AD, Hadrian was elected to the office of quaestor. This was a major stepping stone in the ascent through the cursus honorum, the range of offices which Roman politicians ascended through before being made consul or the governor of a province. As quaestor, he served closely with Trajan and liaised between the emperor and the Senate. There could often be some snobbery on display within the latter body concerning the perceived provincialism of figures like Hadrian from Hispania. On one occasion, for instance, Hadrian is said to have read a speech of the emperor's to the Senate, which sparked a chorus of laughter within the chamber due to his accent and pronunciation. Taking this to heart, Hadrian endeavored afterwards to improve his oratorical abilities until he spoke with as little inflection as possible. A huge amount of imperial power within the Roman Empire was based on the support of the military. Without the backing of the legions, an emperor could end up overthrown and dead, just like Caligula and Nero had in times gone by. Thus, it was important for Trajan to spend a large amount of time securing the approval of the legions. There were few better ways to achieve this than through fresh conquests. This would also serve the added benefit of securing the border when it came to one region, Dacia, in what is now Romania. Domitian had unsuccessfully attempted to reduce the Dacians to Roman rule, and Trajan now set out in 101 AD to succeed where his near predecessor had failed. Hadrian was appointed to the imperial army that headed for Dacia. He crossed the natural border of the Roman Empire, the river Danube, into Eastern Europe at the head of 2 legionary columns, backed up by as many as 9 legions which numbered in the region of 70,000 to 80,000 troops. Hadrian was in Trajan's personal entourage at the start of the campaign, one which saw the Roman armies advance into the heart of Dacia, burning villages and settlements along the way until they met and defeated the armies of the Dacian king Decebalus at the Third Battle of Tapi in September 101 AD. However, before he could personally play a part in the battle, Hadrian was sent back to Rome to take up the post of quaestor, an important office, though given the value that the Romans placed on martial valor, he must have been dismayed to have had his role in the Dacian War cut short. Despite securing a victory over the Dacians at Tapi, Trajan grew concerned about the onset of winter and decided to wait until the following spring of 102 AD to resume hostilities. The lull in the fighting was exploited by Decebalus, who regrouped his forces and then launched a counterattack in the winter. This resulted in another defeat for the Dacians at the Battle of Adamclisi, one which ultimately forced the Dacian king to sue for peace. This was agreed in 102 AD, with favorable terms for the Romans over their defeated enemies. Due to this, a large part of Dacia, along the Danube, was ceded to Rome, whilst Dacia itself became a vassal-like state, which would henceforth act as a buffer zone between Rome and the various migrating tribes to the east. Yet, despite surviving the war, Decebalus had no intention of being Rome's vassal. And after an interval of several years, in which he rebuilt his forces and fortifications, he launched a surprise attack on the Romans in 105 AD. This took Trajan by surprise at first, but he soon gathered his forces and constructed a massive bridge over the Danube, now named Trajan's Bridge, which according to accounts spanned over 3,700 feet in length. This formed the gateway which Trajan's legions used to march headlong into the Dacian heartlands once again, marking the start of the Second Dacian War in 105 AD. During this conflict, Hadrian was again in Trajan's personal service, at least during the early stages of the campaign. Later, he was given his own independent command, one which helped to mark him out as a military leader in his own right and endeared him to the men under his command. After marching into the heart of Dacia, Trajan's legions assaulted the Dacian capital, Sarmisegetusa. After besieging the city and cutting off its supply of water, the capital eventually fell and was then razed to the ground on Trajan's orders, to prevent it being used as a rallying point in the future. Decebalus fled and took his own life. Word then reached Trajan that Decebalus had hidden the contents of his massive treasury somewhere nearby, and soon afterwards its location was revealed to the Romans by a member of the Dacian king's entourage, leading to the hoard's recovery. This reportedly consisted of over 150 metric tons of gold and over 300 metric tons of silver, which was used after the Dacian War to help fund various building projects and celebrations back in the city of Rome. One of which, Trajan's Column, still stands in Rome today and depicts the chain of events surrounding the Dacian Wars. Following the Dacian Wars, Hadrian was appointed in 106 AD to be the governor of Lower Pannonia or Pannonia Inferior, a province on the western border of Dacia covering the region approximating with parts of modern-day Hungary, Serbia, and Croatia. This was partly as a reward for his conduct during the war against the Dacians, and partly due to Hadrian's knowledge of the region and its people, having traversed it many times during the years of the Dacian Wars. This was an important posting at the time. Pannonia was a frontier province on the northern border, one which lay next to the weakest point in the northern frontier's defenses, the strip of land between the river Rhine and the river Danube where Rome could not use the rivers as a natural defensive point. In appointing Hadrian to this posting, Trajan was signifying his trust in him, as there were Germanic and Asiatic tribes such as the Marcomanni and Sarmatians beyond the frontier here that posed a distinct threat to the empire's borders. Hadrian was now, despite only being in his early 30s, a high-ranking general, as well as a talented administrator and politician, one clearly marked out for greater things. That was borne out when in 108 AD he was elected, despite his young age, to become one of Rome's 2 consuls for that year, marking his ascent to the highest political position in the empire, just below the emperor himself. After his tenure as consul ended, Hadrian traveled to Athens. There, he was the city's chief magistrate for a time around 112 AD, reaffirming his affinity for Greek culture during his stay in the city which had once been the home of so many great Greek philosophers, playwrights, and historians during the classical era, though Athens had become reduced to a bit of a provincial backwater by the 2nd century AD, its primary economic function being as a tourist center for Hellenophiles like Hadrian. Unfortunately, we have few other details regarding Hadrian's life during these years between the early 110s AD and the mid-110s AD. It has been speculated by many classical scholars that this absence of him from the historical record, and the lack of definitive statements by Trajan during these years that Hadrian was clearly his successor, points towards a cooling of the relationship between the emperor and his younger cousin. There is substantial reason to believe this is the case, and that Hadrian's subsequent ascent to the imperial office was more owing to the influence of Trajan's wife Plotina than the emperor himself. The next substantial evidence we have of Hadrian's whereabouts comes from around 114 AD when he was summoned to accompany the emperor on his next great military expedition. This was against Rome's perennial rival in the east, the Parthian Empire, a polity which had ruled over Mesopotamia and Persia, in what is now Iraq and Iran, for over 2 centuries. The Parthians were one of the few people who could match Rome's power. Indeed, they had, like the Dacians, been responsible for defeating and humiliating Roman armies in past confrontations and proved themselves to be the most stubborn and persistent of Rome's enemies. Despite numerous large military invasions over the years, the Romans had failed to make any inroads into conquering Parthia. Instead, the 2 powers had become locked in a seemingly never-ending border conflict, one which was often fought with the aim of placing their own supporters on the throne of the Kingdom of Armenia, a buffer state in the Caucasus. In 113 AD, fresh tensions had erupted between the 2 powers over Armenia, and Trajan determined to conquer Parthia once and for all. In 114 AD, he assembled a huge army in the east, and it was there that Hadrian joined him as he prepared to march eastwards into Mesopotamia. The expedition would be the most successful ever launched by a Roman emperor against the Parthians, but it would also end with Hadrian succeeding Trajan. As with Trajan's Dacian campaign, the invasion of Parthia that began in 114 AD with a movement into Armenia involved upwards of a dozen legions. Once again, Hadrian was appointed to Trajan's entourage, which accompanied the emperor to successfully secure Armenia in late 114 AD, after which the Roman forces marched south into Mesopotamia, where they took the city of Charax near the northern shores of the Persian Gulf in 116 AD. More importantly, the capital of the Parthian Empire, Ctesiphon, soon fell to the Romans, and Trajan began making plans to divide Mesopotamia up into Roman provinces and incorporate it into the empire. This marked the furthest extent of Rome's eastern expansion. During this campaign, Trajan had successfully reduced the Parthians to the status of a near vassal state. But the campaign had taken a considerable toll on his health, as he was, by this time, in his early 60s, which, combined with the hundreds of miles of travel, hot weather, and stresses on his body, took a toll on his condition. Plans were soon in motion for the emperor to return to Rome to recuperate, but he died on the way back to Rome at the city of Selinus in southern Turkey in August 117 AD after suffering a stroke. As he had no children, Trajan's succession had been in a state of confusion for some years. Early in the reign, it had been made clear that Hadrian was a favored relative, but the deceased emperor had never explicitly named him as his heir, leaving the succession open to interpretation when he died in 117 AD. However, within days of Trajan's passing, his wife, Pompeia Plotina, presented a document to the Senate which stated that the emperor, on his deathbed, had adopted Hadrian as his son and successor. This development was controversial, and the authenticity of the letter was clearly open to doubt, leading to rumors that Hadrian was Pompeia Plotinus' choice as successor and not Trajan's. Despite such reservations, there was no other clear candidate from within Trajan's extended family, and with Plotina petitioning aggressively on his behalf in Rome, and the Senate wishing to avoid a civil war of the kind which had occurred in the late 60s AD following Nero's fall from power, Hadrian was soon confirmed as Trajan's successor. Moreover, Hadrian's position at the time of Trajan's death, stationed in the east with numerous legions now under his control, ensured that no military commander elsewhere in the empire was in a good position to challenge him for the succession. Thus, once Hadrian was proclaimed Caesar by the eastern armies, a letter was sent to the Senate, the members of which had little choice but to accept his accession. Celebrations were held in the imperial capital to mark the new emperor's rise to power. At 41 years of age, Hadrian was now emperor of the largest and most powerful empire the world had seen, one which stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the sands of Arabia in the east, and from the North Sea to the Sahara Desert in the south. Yet the sheer size of Rome's territory was so vast that it presented a problem of administration. It was for this very reason that over a century earlier, Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, had counseled that his successors should consolidate the empire and establish strong borders instead of expanding further. Trajan, more than any other emperor after Augustus, had violated that advice by conquering Dacia and large parts of the Parthian Empire, while in 106 AD he had also annexed the Nabatean kingdom that ruled Jordan and northwestern Arabia. Hadrian perhaps disapproved of this huge expansion of the empire by Trajan. At least, this is what one of his first actions as emperor would suggest. While Dacia and the Nabatean territories would remain under Roman rule for centuries to come, Hadrian almost immediately decided, after he became emperor, to withdraw the legions from Mesopotamia, abandoning his predecessor's Parthian conquests. The Parthian royal family and elite quickly moved back into the cities and began re-establishing control over their state. Trajan's costly war in the east had been for nothing. There were good reasons for this initial decision by Hadrian. Strategically, he was probably correct in assuming that Rome could not maintain control over Mesopotamia and would have simply become mired in a frontier war, with the Parthians launching attacks constantly out of Persia. More immediately, with the legions tied down in Mesopotamia, different groups had begun to consider revolting against Roman rule within the empire. Foremost here were the Jewish people, large communities of which existed not just in Roman Judea, but also in provinces like Egypt, Cyrenaica, and Cyprus. Back in 66 AD, the Jews had launched a massive revolt against Roman rule, one which led to a 7-year-long war before the Romans crushed the insurrection. Now, in 115 AD, a second Jewish revolt broke out. This one primarily took place amongst the diaspora Jews in North Africa and Cyprus. If our main sources for it are to be believed, then the revolt quickly led to the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. When news reached him in Mesopotamia of the revolt in 115 AD, Trajan had taken steps to move legions from the northern frontier to the eastern Mediterranean to deal with the onslaught. The insurrection had been largely crushed by the time Hadrian became emperor in 117 AD, but this in itself seemed to have created a problem. The general appointed to suppress the Jewish revolt, a man named Lucius Quietus, was deemed to have become too powerful. Fearing a challenge to his succession, Hadrian demonstrated his ruthlessness straight away as Rome's new ruler by having Quietus discreetly killed in 118 AD. Following his accession as emperor, Hadrian remained in the Roman East for a time, overseeing the mopping up of the Jewish rebellion in the region. Whilst back in Rome, the Praetorian Guard, the bodyguard of the emperors who were the only force allowed into the Eternal City and its environs, under the command of Hadrian's ally, Publius Attianus, rounded up and executed a number of high-ranking officials who were perceived as potential enemies of the new emperor. These included a high-ranking general by the name of Aulus Cornelius Palma and 2 senators, Lucius Publilius Celsus and Gaius Avidius Nigrinus. Nigrinus, in particular, was seen as a threat to Hadrian, as he had sufficient wealth, rank, and connections to rival him. This created some level of animosity between Hadrian and the Senate, which, combined with his overt affinity for Greek culture, and his prolonged absences from Rome over the 2 decades of his reign, would often make him an unpopular emperor amongst the Roman elite. With the legions being pulled out of Parthia, the second Jewish revolt fully suppressed, and all potential challengers to his rule eliminated, Hadrian now set off for Rome. Once there, he began considering the manner in which he would actually rule as emperor. He eventually decided upon what was a very unusual course for a Roman emperor. Rather than governing from Rome or engaging in military conquests, he would instead undertake a lengthy tour of the provinces. During this, he would meet with the local elites and redress whatever grievances they had. He would also inquire as to what needed to be done in each region to improve Roman government there and the lives of the empire's subjects, while also ameliorating threats posed to Roman rule, for instance by improving border defenses or rooting out pirates and brigands. Thus, after a series of celebrations in Rome to acknowledge his ascent as emperor, and the cancellation of a large amount of tax debts left over from Trajan's reign, Hadrian set off to tour the provinces of the empire. He would spend well over half of his reign traveling away from Rome. This was often accompanied by his wife, Vibia Sabina, as well as his entourage and the imperial staff, which all in all could amount to upwards of 5,000 people moving from city to city and provincial town to border fortresses. Hadrian and his vast itinerant court set off from Rome in 121 AD. Their first port of call was the western provinces. Thus, he spent the next 2 years touring what we would now call France, Germany, England, and Spain, though which were then known as Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and Hispania. Much of his focus during these sojourns was on border defenses. The northern frontiers of Rome's empire were the most open to invasion. The Atlantic Ocean and the Sahara Desert formed large impenetrable borders to the west and south, but in the north, the Germanic tribes of wider Germania posed a perennial threat to the Rhine frontier, while in Britannia, the Caledonians and Brigantes remained unconquered in what is now lowland Scotland. Accordingly, while in Germania, Hadrian ordered the building of a new set of wooden fortifications along the border. He also began a notable practice associated with his time as emperor while here, in that he began to dress like a Roman soldier, lived like the legionaries, and ate the same food that they did. Hadrian wanted to experience what life was actually like for the average Roman soldier, the better to understand the needs and concerns of those who protected Rome's borders. In Britannia, Hadrian undertook a building project which would become perhaps the most enduring legacy of his entire reign. The Romans had only first begun to conquer southern Britain in the 40s AD under Emperor Claudius. Thereafter, the conquest of the island had proceeded quite slowly, with Domitian being the first emperor during whose reign a major campaign was launched into what we would now call Scotland, but which the Romans termed Caledonia. This had proved abortive, and during Trajan's time, the legions had been pulled back into northern England. During his visit to Britain in 122 AD, Hadrian became, according to one ancient source, the first emperor to build a wall 80 miles long to separate the Romans from the barbarians. Hadrian's Wall, as it has become known, ran for 73 miles across northern England, from the Solway Firth to the River Tyne. Built of stone, it was punctuated by forts along its course and smaller turrets and guard posts every mile or so. A vallum or ditch was also dug south of the wall as an additional defensive point should the wall be penetrated, with turf walls in other places. This was an immense defensive fortification, one which would largely form the northern border of the Roman Empire in Britain for the next 2.5 centuries. It still stands today, an enduring testament to Hadrian's administrative reforms. Having overseen the initiation of the wall-building program in Britain, Hadrian and his court then traveled back across the English Channel and south through Gaul. Here, he learned of the death of his great patroness, Trajan's wife, Plotina, who had done so much to ensure that Hadrian succeeded her husband as emperor. In her honor, he ordered the construction of a grand basilica in the town of Nemausus, modern-day Nîmes in southern France. Then it was onwards into Hispania and across the Mediterranean to North Africa. His visit to the latter region in 123 AD was significant, as a revolt had broken out in Mauritania, the region approximating to Algeria and Morocco. This was a perennial problem of Roman rule in the region, with Berber bandits often emerging out of the Atlas Mountains to raid the coastal colonies. Having implemented measures to secure the provinces there, Hadrian learned that to the east, the Parthians, having reimposed their rule over Mesopotamia, were now yet again threatening the eastern border. Thus, in 123 AD, Hadrian set off eastwards across North Africa. Along the way, he passed through regions in Cyrenaica and Egypt that had been badly damaged several years earlier during the Second Jewish Revolt. He took steps as he passed through to facilitate the rejuvenation of Roman colonies damaged in the violence. Hadrian was not interested in renewing the perennial war with Parthia, and so, upon arriving at the eastern frontier, he quickly concluded a peace agreement with the Parthians to end the conflict before it got any worse. He then set about inspecting the frontier defenses in the area, particularly along the edges of the Syrian desert towards the Euphrates River. Once this was done, he continued his journey northwest into Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, and eventually entered the city of Claudiopolis, the site of the city of Bolu today. This was an ancient city with a history dating back to the time of the Hittite Empire. Hadrian's arrival here was significant in that it was while he was visiting Claudiopolis that the emperor first met a young man named Antinous. He was just a child of 12 or so at the time, and his entry into the imperial entourage was probably part of a Roman custom whereby the children of local elites were sent to Rome to be educated. The goal being to inculcate them to the virtues of Roman rule and society, and in the process, create a more loyal following in the provinces. Hadrian would later develop an infatuation with Antinous around 128 AD, a topic we will return to. From Asia Minor and Anatolia, Hadrian and his party traveled onwards to Greece in 124 AD. While here, the emperor commissioned the building of new temples and fountains and took part in the Eleusinian Mysteries, the secret of ancient Greek rituals focused on the worship of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture, and Persephone, goddess of the underworld and wife of Hades. The emperor particularly focused his attention on Athens, which was given a new library, aqueduct, and housing district as a reflection of Hadrian's affection for the city and as thanks both for his reception and his treatment during his time as the city's magistrate many years earlier, before he became emperor. In response, the city's authorities ordered the erection of a statue of Hadrian, which was placed outside the temple of Olympia and Zeus in Athens. The statue is still standing in Athens today, though it is badly damaged. Many years later, an Arch of Hadrian was also erected in Athens. All of this signifies the extent to which imperial rule in Roman times, as much as the empire was a homogeneous state, was in many ways based on relationships between cities and municipal authorities with the city of Rome and its rulers. Following his extended visit to Athens, Hadrian and his large court entourage decided to return to Rome itself, although detouring to Sicily in 126 AD before heading back to the Eternal City, where the Roman Senate must have been somewhat perturbed to only be seeing the emperor for the first time in half a decade. This return to the capital left an enduring legacy. During it, Hadrian appears to have ordered the reconstruction of a temple on the site of an earlier religious building erected nearly a century and a half earlier by Caesar Augustus' most powerful general and ally, Marcus Agrippa. Agrippa's temple had burned down in the interim, and now Hadrian was reusing the site. The building that resulted from this is the Pantheon, one of the most significant architectural achievements of the Romans. Its name derives from the fact that it was not dedicated to any one deity, but rather the entire pantheon of Roman gods and goddesses. It was a marvel of Roman engineering, one which had the largest unsupported dome in the world until modern times, and was constructed from materials including stone from all over the empire. Standing 43 meters tall, the Pantheon would be studied by numerous architects over a millennium later during the Renaissance, including Brunelleschi, who designed the dome of Florence's cathedral, in order to learn how a dome of such a size did not collapse in on the building. The Pantheon in Paris, France, too, was also later modeled on the temple constructed on Hadrian's order. It was during this return to the capital that Hadrian also oversaw the final stages of the first phase of construction of his new villa located at Tibur, modern-day Tivoli, in the Sabine Hills, which was located 18 miles from Rome. Despite 3 centuries of immense wealth amongst the Roman elite and the construction of hundreds of palatial villas, Hadrian's villa at Tibur was the largest Roman villa ever built. A second phase of building work was ordered by Hadrian at this time, and it would continue for much of the next decade. The remains of the villa still attest to its grandeur today. One further development of note during Hadrian's period back in Rome in the mid-120s AD was his role in the development of the Praetor's Edict. This was one of the most substantial law codes compiled in Roman times. In 125 AD, Hadrian employed the jurist Salvius Julianus to compile together the vast body of Roman laws into a major collection. He paid Julianus twice the normal salary of a senior Roman jurist and presumably made allowance for him to employ a team of scribes and officials while he was undertaking the work. While it has been interpreted in different ways by historians ever since, with some suggesting Julianus simply gathered together some documents, and others arguing that he codified hundreds of years of Roman law going back to the Republican era, there is no doubt that what was produced by Julianus under Hadrian's orders was an important project in terms of the legal codices of the Roman Empire. It would have a bearing in centuries to come on Justinian's law code, and through that, it left a legacy to medieval Europe in terms of our understanding of civil law, as this was derived from the laws of the Romans. Over the space of many years of travel, Hadrian had become accustomed to never staying in one place for very long, and in 128 AD, after less than 2 years back in Italy, he set off again on his travels with the imperial court and staff. On this second imperial tour, he headed first to North Africa again before returning to Greece, where he once again took part in the Eleusinian mysteries. He would spend the next 4 years traveling around the region, undertaking various reforms and projects in Greece, Asia Minor, and the other eastern provinces. For instance, whilst in Greece around 131 AD, he oversaw the creation of the Panhellenion, a council comprised of the various Greek city-states. Through this, Hadrian hoped to restore Greek culture to the vitality it had possessed centuries earlier, at the height of the city-states of Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth. His admiration for Greek society was on display to the whole world in his habit of growing out his beard to a good length, something which was considered unmanly to the Romans, but which Hadrian had little qualms about adopting as a fashion. In 130 AD, Hadrian's travels brought him to Egypt. Amongst other activities here, he visited the tomb of Pompey the Great at Pelusium. Pompey, more so than any other figure in Rome's history, had been responsible for conquering large parts of the eastern Mediterranean, notably Syria from the Seleucid Empire, the kingdom of Pontus on the southern shores of the Black Sea, and the establishment of both Ptolemaic Egypt and Herodian Judea as client states. Hadrian's visit to the tomb of Pompey and his refurbishment of the site points towards both his patronage of the Greek East and also a need to reaffirm Rome's control over these provinces after many years of unrest in the shape of the Second Jewish Revolt and border clashes with the Parthians. It highlights the manner in which Hadrian's touring of the provinces was as much a performative exercise meant to reinforce imperial rule as it was an administrative one. The emperor's trip to Egypt soon made the country the scene of an immense personal tragedy for Hadrian. Around 128 AD, the emperor had taken Antinous as a lover, the young Greek that he had first met in Anatolia back in 123 AD and who had been sent to Rome as part of the imperial household there. Over the next 2 years, he became infatuated by him. He was consequently distraught when, on a boat trip on the River Nile, Antinous drowned either in late September or sometime in early October 130 AD. The day in question is believed to have been the feast that year of Osiris, the god of the River Nile and the underworld in Egyptian mythology. It is unclear whether Antinous' death was an accident or whether he had been sacrificed to the River Nile as an offering on the feast of Osiris. What we do know is that Hadrian was devastated by his loss and honored the death of his lover by declaring him to be divine. After this, he started a cult in Antinous' honor, even naming a city after him, the city of Antinopolis on the River Nile. Moreover, Hadrian ordered the construction of statues all over the empire in his lover's memory. Incredibly, there are more statues and images of Antinous extant today than for any other figure from Roman imperial history, other than Caesar Augustus and Hadrian himself. Following the events in Egypt, Hadrian and his entourage, many of the members of which must surely have been tired of the emperor's eternal travels by now, set off for the eastern frontier again, before returning to Greece once again. There, he oversaw the final stages of the construction of the massive temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens in 132 AD. It was while he was there that word reached the itinerant imperial court of fresh unrest amongst the Jewish people. This third Jewish revolt, as it is sometimes termed, was led by a Jewish rebel leader by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba. The causes of the revolt were similar to the revolts of 66 AD and 115 AD, specifically Roman persecution of the Jews for their religious beliefs and the imposition of discriminatory policies such as the Fiscus Judaicus, or Jewish tax, as well as Roman colonization of Judea. This erupted into fresh violence in 132 AD. The Bar Kokhba revolt, as it is now more commonly known, was more of a full-scale war than a mere local insurrection, as Hadrian had to call upon the support of over half a dozen legions numbering upwards of 100,000 troops to deal with a Jewish force, which itself numbered upwards of 200,000 according to accounts. After 3 years of bitter fighting, the uprising was eventually largely quelled by 135 AD, although isolated pockets of resistance continued in the Levant into 136 AD. The suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt had an enormous bearing on the history of the Jewish people. Since the early 6th century, at the time of the Babylonian conquest of the Kingdom of Judah and the destruction of the First Temple of Jerusalem, there had been periodic events that occurred in the Levant which led to tens of thousands of Jews leaving the region, so beginning the Jewish diaspora in places like North Africa and even as far east as India. More Jewish people again left Judea following the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem during the First Jewish Revolt in 70 AD. Now, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD, and the imposition of a new wave of anti-Jewish legislation and policies, led to yet another flight from Judea of its monotheistic inhabitants. Hadrian played a part in this. Indeed, as early as 130 AD, when he had passed through the region, he had ordered the foundation of Aelia Capitolina, a new Roman colony, on the ruins of what had been parts of the city of Jerusalem before its destruction in 70 AD. The order to establish Aelia Capitolina was part of the reason for the revolt 2 years later, while the continuing efforts to impose more colonial settlement on the city and province in the years that followed led to further migration of Jews out of Roman Judea. Hence, Hadrian fueled the growth of the Jewish diaspora in the middle of the 2nd century AD. By the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian's health was declining precipitously. Cassius Dio described several of his symptoms, and from these, we learn that he was suffering from edema, a serious condition involving excessive fluid retention, and epistaxis, severe blood loss from the nose. He probably also had a serious heart condition. It was on account of his illnesses and the difficulties they were creating, as well as the illness and impending death of his wife, Vibia Sabina, that the itinerant court finally returned to Rome around 134 AD, leaving commanders in the east to oversee the final suppression of the Third Jewish Revolt. In the capital, he turned his attention to the succession and adopted Lucius Sionius Commodus as his son, making him his heir. Commodus was the son-in-law of Gaius Avidius Nigrinus, one of the consuls who had been executed all the way back in 118 AD. However, Commodus died in January 138 AD, prompting Hadrian to then adopt Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus as his heir, a man who would later become Emperor Antoninus Pius. Hadrian also made provision for Antoninus to adopt the future rulers of Rome after him, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Thus, in this later stage of his life, Hadrian influenced the succession of the emperors for most of the remainder of the 2nd century AD. Towards the end of Hadrian's reign, he ordered that his brother-in-law, Lucius Julius Ursus Servianus, and Servianus' grandson Gnaeus Pedanius Fuscus Salinator, both be put to death. He did this because Servianus, who had at the start of Hadrian's reign been a possible candidate for succession, was thought to be involved in an attempted coup in 137 AD by his grandson Salinator, who wanted power for himself. Although by 138 AD Servianus was much too old to be a viable successor, yet his grandson Salinator was still young and so posed a threat to the emperor. Before his death, Servianus is said to have prayed that Hadrian would, quote, long for death but be unable to die. He nearly had his wish. During his final illness, Hadrian is said to have attempted to take his own life on several occasions, such was the pain he was in from his physical ailments. However, he was prevented from taking such action. By the summer of 138 AD, Hadrian's health had deserted him to such an extent that he retreated to his villa at Baiae, near modern-day Naples. He died here on the 10th of July, 138 AD, aged 62, after a reign of 21 years. He was first buried at Puteoli, close to Baiae, but subsequently, his body was taken to Rome and buried in the gardens of Domitia. Once the tomb of Hadrian was completed by Antoninus Pius in 139 AD, his body was cremated and his ashes were placed there in a purpose-built mausoleum. This can still be seen to this day in Rome. He was interred here along with the remains of his wife, Vibia Sabina, and his first adopted son, Lucius Aelius, who were also placed there with him. Following his death, Antoninus insisted that Hadrian be given divine honors, and a temple was to be built for him on the Campus Martius, seemingly in opposition to a contingent within the Senate who were opposed to the deification of Hadrian. Subsequently, the Senate gave Antoninus the title Pius in recognition of his final act of loyalty to Hadrian. Following the lead of the great British Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, it has been theorized that Hadrian's reign lay in the middle of a period of 5 good emperors, under whom a Pax Romana or Roman peace prevailed in the Mediterranean world, and people enjoyed an unprecedented quality of life. These 5 good emperors were Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. After that, Rome began to enter a period of turmoil, beginning with the reign of the tyrannical Emperor Commodus, then proceeding through the rule of the Severan dynasty before a crisis of the 3rd century began in 235 AD. During the latter, a half-century of civil wars saw dozens of emperors come and quickly go, while the empire's borders were raided and broken through by Germanic and Asiatic groups like the Franks, Sarmatians, and Alans. A fiscal crisis led to the Roman coinage becoming largely valueless, creating hyperinflation of a kind which the Romans didn't know how to deal with. As rose-tinted as the theory of the 5 good emperors is, there were definite signs of trouble ahead in Hadrian's day. The coinage was already being regularly devalued in the 2nd century AD, setting a dangerous precedent for the 3rd century, while tribes like the Marcomanni and Quadi were gathering in large numbers along the northern border and preparing to break through the Danube and Rhine frontiers. In the end, Hadrian's approach to ruling the empire, by initiating a program of administrative, social, and political reform, was probably the right one. But he had focused on the wrong things, worrying about building walls across northern Britain and establishing colonies in Judea, when what was needed was a reorganization of the military, reform of the coinage, and a reconsideration of how best to defend the northern frontier along the Rhine and Danube rivers. Emperor Hadrian was an enlightened ruler, there can be little doubt about that. Over a reign of slightly more than 2 decades, he energetically traveled around Rome's vast empire and engaged in a truly innovative reform program by consulting with local elites and trying to determine what needed to be done in each province to make life more satisfactory for citizens there and in order to make the government run more smoothly. This was a truly unique approach to ruling the empire, and Hadrian was the first emperor who didn't prioritize conquering new territories like Trajan had, indolently enjoying his dictatorial power like Caligula briefly did, or focusing his energies on satiating the Roman mob through public works programs in the Eternal City itself, much as Vespasian had. Instead, he tried to improve the empire broadly. There is a giant wall across northern England still standing nearly 2 millennia later to attest to this. His tragedy was that he failed to see the bigger, systemic issues that were facing the empire, and in so doing, could not prevent the crisis that would envelop Rome a century after his own time. So what do you think of Emperor Hadrian? Was he one of Rome's most enlightened emperors, a visionary who saw beyond war and conquest? Or was he ultimately a man who missed the signs, who built monuments, but ignored the cracks beneath them? Let us know in the comments, and as always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more incredible journeys through ancient history.